The match scratched against the box. The cowboy held it near the kindling, waiting for the flame to catch. Behind him, 37 women stood frozen in formation. Their prison uniforms hung loose on frames that had forgotten what fullness felt like. None of them had seen fire used for cooking in months. The smell of mesquite smoke drifted across the compound yard. One woman's knees buckled slightly. Another pressed her hand against her stomach without thinking. The cowboys didn't turn around, but they heard the small sounds of bodies remembering hunger. The wire fence between them might as well have been invisible. These men wore hats and boots like they'd just ridden in from a ranch, not a military base. The fire grew. One of the cowboys pulled out a grate and set it over the flames. The metal expanded with heat, making small pinging sounds. The women watched every movement. Some had stopped blinking. Their faces showed nothing, but their bodies leaned forward by inches. The training to remain expressionless was fighting against something more primitive. It was April 1945. The location was a detention facility in Crystal City, Texas. These women were Japanese nationals, most of them wives and mothers who'd been living in Peru before the war. The U.S. government had brought them here as part of a prisoner exchange program that never quite materialized. Now they existed in a strange limbo, neither prisoners of war nor enemy aliens, just women waiting. The cowboys were local ranch hands hired as camp maintenance workers. They'd been told to repair a section of fence near the women's quarters. But it was Saturday, and they'd brought their lunch. One of them, a man named Ray Boswell, age 23, had packed enough brisket for a crew twice their size. His mother always overestimated. He'd complained about it that morning. The other cowboy was Vernon Hastings, 19, too young for overseas deployment because of a childhood injury that left him with a limp. He'd spent the entire war feeling useless, watching friends ship out while he fixed fences and herded cattle. Now he stood in front of 37 women who looked at him like he was holding salvation in a cast-iron skillet. The weight of that gaze made his hands shake slightly. Ray set the brisket on the grate. The fat began to render immediately, dripping into the fire and sending up small bursts of flame. The smell that rose from that meat was obscene in its richness. It rolled across the yard like a physical thing. Several women closed their eyes. One made a sound in her throat that she immediately tried to swallow. The matron guard, stationed at the corner, looked away. Among the women stood Fumiko Hayashi, 31 years old, a schoolteacher from Lima who hadn't taught a class in 3 years. She had a daughter somewhere in the camp, separated by age group housing rules she still didn't understand. Fumiko had learned to keep her face empty, to show nothing that could be used against her. But the smell of that meat broke something in her carefully maintained composure. Next to her was Kaiko Tanaka, 47, who'd run a small restaurant in Peru with her husband before men in suits had arrived at her door. She knew meat. She knew cooking. She knew exactly what cut that was, how long it had been smoked, what kind of wood they'd used. Her professional mind cataloged details while her starving body simply screamed. The camp food was adequate for survival, nothing more. This was something else entirely. Vernon turned around. He didn't plan to. His body just did it, pulled by the sound of those small gasps and swallowed whimpers. He looked at the women's faces and saw his own mother, his sister, his aunt. Ray caught his eye. Something passed between them without words. Vernon picked up the grate, brisket and all, and walked toward the fence. The matron guard stepped forward. Her hand went to the whistle around her neck. Protocol was clear. No fraternization, no gifts, no contact between workers and detainees. Vernon stopped walking, but he didn't step back. The grate was still in his hands, smoke rising from the meat, and he stood there at the fence line like a man waiting for permission he knew wouldn't come. Ray moved next. He walked to Vernon's side, not saying anything, just standing there in solidarity. The matron's hand stayed on the whistle. For a long moment, nobody moved. The only sound was the fat still sizzling, hitting the hot metal with small hisses. The smell kept spreading. indifferent to rules and regulations and the machinery of wartime detention. Then Vernon did something that would show up in 3 different written reports within 48 hours. He set the grate down on the ground, right against the fence line on his side. He pulled out his pocket knife and began cutting the brisket into pieces, not serving it, not handing it through the wire, just cutting it, methodically, like he was simply preparing his lunch and happened to be doing it very close to the fence. Ray understood immediately. He walked back to their truck and returned with paper sacks they'd packed their lunch in. He set them down on the ground, also on the workers' side of the fence, and stepped back. The Cowboys then did something extraordinary. They turned their backs completely to the women and walked about 15 feet away where they sat down and began talking loudly about the fence repair, gesturing at the posts like they were deeply invested in the conversation. The matron guard stood frozen. The rule book didn't cover this exact situation. The men hadn't handed anything to the prisoners. They hadn't breached the fence. They'd simply put their lunch down and walked away from it. She looked at the women, at their faces where small cracks were beginning to show through the careful blankness. She looked at the meat, smoking in the sun. Then she looked at her own hands. Fumiko moved first. She walked to the fence with steps that tried to maintain dignity while every cell in her body wanted to run. She knelt down at the wire. The meat was 6 inches away on the other side. She could touch it if she reached through the fence. Her hand extended slowly, shaking, fingers pushing through the diamond-shaped gaps in the wire until they reached the paper sack. She pulled it through, the paper crinkling loudly in the silence. Nobody stopped her. She stood up, holding the sack like it might evaporate. Then she turned to the other women and did something that would be remembered for decades. She began dividing the portions, using her hands to tear the meat into smaller pieces, making sure there was enough for everyone. The teacher in her couldn't help but count, couldn't help but calculate fairness even in this moment of overwhelming need. Keiko came forward next, then others, forming a quiet line without being told. They reached through the fence one by one, pulling through pieces of brisket wrapped in brown paper. Some took their portion and stepped back immediately, hands trembling as they lifted food to their mouths. Others stood at the fence longer, just holding the meat, staring at it like they needed to convince themselves it was real before they could eat it. One woman, barely 20 years old, named Sachiko Watanabe, bit into her piece and immediately began crying. Not loud sobs, just tears running down her face while she chewed. She'd been pregnant when they'd arrested her family in Lima. She'd lost the baby on the ship coming to Texas. The taste of that brisket brought back every meal her mother had ever cooked for her, every moment of safety she'd known before the world had broken apart. Vernon and Ray stayed where they were, backs turned, talking about nothing. But Vernon's voice caught once, and he cleared his throat roughly. Ray pulled his hat down lower over his eyes. They could hear the small sounds behind them, paper rustling, quiet chewing, one woman saying something in Japanese that made others murmur in agreement. The matron guard had moved to the far corner of the yard. She was looking in a completely different direction. The meat didn't last long. 37 women divided between them what had been meant for 4 ranch hands. Each person got maybe 2 ounces, 3 at most, but they ate slowly, making it last. Some saved half their portion, wrapping it carefully in the paper to take back to their quarters. One elderly woman held her piece up to her face and just smelled it for a full minute before taking the first bite. When the last piece had been pulled through the fence, something shifted in the yard. The women didn't return to formation immediately. They stood in small clusters, still holding the brown paper, talking quietly among themselves. Fumiko folded her paper sack carefully, pressing the creases flat. She would keep it under her pillow. Years later, her daughter would find it in a box of her mother's belongings and wonder why she de-saved a piece of trash. Vernon finally stood up. He turned around slowly, not looking directly at the women, but not avoiding them either. He walked to the fence and picked up the grate, now empty except for a few bits of charred fat. He didn't say anything. What could he say? "You're welcome" seemed obscene. "Sorry" seemed inadequate. So he just nodded once, general and to no one in particular, and walked back to the truck. Ray followed, carrying their tools. As they loaded the truck bed, the women began moving back into formation, responding to some signal the cowboys couldn't hear. The blankness was returning to their faces, the careful emptiness that was required for survival in places like this. But it didn't fit quite as well anymore. Something had been disrupted. A small crack had appeared in the machinery of dehumanization, and everyone who'd been in that yard knew it. The matron guard approached the cowboys before they left. She was a heavy-set woman named Dorothy Mills, 53, who'd taken this job because she needed the money and it was better than factory work. She looked at Vernon for a long moment. He braced himself for a reprimand, maybe a threat to report what had happened. Instead, she said quietly, "The fence section near the eastern gate needs work too. Probably take you all day next Saturday." Then she walked away. Vernon and Ray drove back to the ranch in silence. They didn't talk about what had happened. Vernon's mother asked that night why he was so quiet, and he said he was tired. Ray told his wife the fence repair had taken longer than expected. Neither man mentioned it to anyone outside their immediate families for 30 years. It wasn't shame exactly. It was more like they'd witnessed something too fragile to be spoken about carelessly. But inside the camp, the story spread immediately. By dinner that evening, every woman in the facility knew about the cowboys and the brisket. The details were repeated, examined, and treasured. Someone remembered that Vernon had a limp. Someone else described exactly how Ray had set down the paper sacks, the care he'd taken to place them within reach. These details mattered. They were evidence that kindness still existed, even here. Fumiko wrote about it in a letter to her sister that was heavily censored before being mailed. 3/4 of what she wrote was blacked out, but one line survived. "Today I remembered what food tastes like when someone wants you to have it." Her sister wouldn't understand the sentence for years, not until Fumiko was released and could explain it fully. But she kept the letter anyway, preserving that one strange line. If this story is touching something in you right now, if you're feeling the weight of that small act of defiance against cruelty, take a moment to hit the like button. Share in the comments if you or someone you know has ever witnessed a moment of unexpected humanity in a dark time. And subscribe, because these stories matter. They're fragile, they're easily lost. But they're proof that even in the machinery of war and imprisonment, individual humans can still choose kindness. Help keep these memories alive. Keiko never forgot the taste of that brisket. For the rest of her life, whenever she smelled mesquite smoke, she would stop whatever she was doing and stand very still. Her children learned not to interrupt her in those moments. She was somewhere else, standing in a prison yard in Texas, watching two young cowboys commit a small act of rebellion against the dehumanization they'd been instructed to maintain. She was remembering what it felt like to be seen as human by someone who had no obligation to see her at all. The following Saturday, Vernon and Ray returned to the camp. They were assigned to work on the eastern gate, just as Dorothy Mills had suggested. They brought their lunch again. This time it was chicken, fried that morning by Ray's mother, who'd been told by her son that he was working a long shift and would need extra. She'd packed enough for 8 people, same as always, and complained about the waste. The women's yard was visible from the eastern gate. The cowboys set up their work area with the same careful positioning as the week before. They built their small fire for coffee. They unpacked their lunch and spread it out on a checkered cloth. And then, as if choreographed though, it never was, they turned their backs and began working on the gate hinges, talking loudly about the rust and the angle of the posts. This time no one hesitated. Fumiko walked to the fence line first, quickly, before anyone could decide to enforce a rule. She pulled through the plate of fried chicken that had been left 6 inches from the wire. Other women followed, forming the same quiet line as before. The portions were divided with the same careful mathematics. The eating was slower this time, more savored, because now they knew it was real, knew it wouldn't be snatched away. Dorothy Mills watched from her station. She made a note in her logbook about fence repairs at the eastern gate. Time started, time completed. She didn't mention the lunch. In the complex moral calculus she'd been performing since taking this job, this was the equation she'd settled on. She wouldn't facilitate it, but she wouldn't stop it either. She would simply be looking in a different direction at crucial moments. It was a small rebellion, but it was hers. This pattern continued for 7 weeks. Every Saturday, the Cowboys arrived with fence work that needed doing and lunches that were too large. Sometimes it was barbecue. Sometimes it was tamales brought by Ray's Mexican grandmother who lived 2 houses down. Once it was a venison stew that Vernon's father had made after a hunting trip. The food was always placed near the fence. The Cowboys were always deeply invested in their work, backs turned at the right moments. The women stopped wearing complete blankness on Saturdays. They couldn't help it. Hope is hard to hide, and they'd started hoping on Friday nights. They'd wonder what the meal would be, discuss it in whispers after lights out. Someone would speculate about beef stew. Someone else would say maybe ham. These conversations were dangerous in their way, building expectation that could be crushed. But they had them anyway because the alternative was to feel nothing, and they'd been doing that for too long already. Other workers at the camp noticed something was happening. A laundry supervisor named Carl Preston asked Vernon about it once, suspicious, thinking maybe the Cowboys were getting something in return, some kind of contraband exchange. Vernon looked at him with an expression so genuinely confused that Carl dropped it. What could these women possibly give? They had nothing. They were nothing, according to the official paperwork. That was the point of places like this. But they weren't nothing, and the Cowboys knew it, and knowing it changed them in small ways. Vernon started reading the newspaper differently, paying attention to the articles about Japanese Americans, about the camps, about the families broken apart by executive orders and wartime paranoia. Ray got into an argument with his uncle at Sunday dinner when the older man said something casually racist about Japs. It was a small argument, quickly smoothed over, but it wouldn't have happened 2 months earlier. The women changed too. Not dramatically, not obviously, but in the subtle ways that happen when someone reminds you that you're human. They stood a little straighter. They complained more, which the guards found annoying but which was actually healthy, actually normal. Fumiko started teaching informal English classes to the younger women, finding a bit of her old professional identity. Keiko began describing recipes in elaborate detail during the evening hours, feeding people with words when actual food was scarce. Sachiko, the young woman who'd cried while eating the first brisket, started smiling occasionally. Just small smiles, barely there, but present. Another woman noticed and mentioned it, and Sakiko said, "I forgot I could." That sentence circulated through the quarters, whispered from bunk to bunk. I forgot I could. It became a kind of mantra, a reminder that the numbness wasn't permanent, that the machinery of imprisonment hadn't completely succeeded in grinding them down to nothing. In the 7th week, something changed. Vernon and Ray arrived on Saturday as usual, but Dorothy Mills met them at the gate with a different expression. Her face was tight, apologetic. Behind her stood a man in an officer's uniform, someone the Cowboys had never seen before. His name was Captain Richard Hewitt, transferred from another facility, a man who believed in regulations the way some people believe in religion. Captain Hewitt informed the Cowboys that their services were no longer required for fence maintenance. The camp would be using military personnel for all repairs going forward. He said it politely but firmly, in a tone that made clear he knew exactly what had been happening every Saturday. Someone had reported it. Maybe Carl Preston, maybe another guard who'd felt uncomfortable with the weekly rule bending. It didn't matter who. The result was the same. Vernon started to speak, then stopped. What could he say? But we were feeding the prisoners, wasn't a defense. It was a confession. Ray's hands curled into fists at his sides, then slowly relaxed. They'd known this could happen. They'd known from the first Saturday that they were operating in a gray area that could be shut down at any moment. That it had lasted 7 weeks was almost surprising. That it was ending now felt inevitable. The women watched from the yard. They understood what was happening without needing to hear the words. The body language told the story clearly enough. The officer's rigid posture, the cowboy's slumped shoulders, Dorothy Mills looking at the ground. Fumiko felt something crack in her chest, some small piece of hope she'd been careful not to examine too closely. She turned away before her face could betray her. The cowboys loaded their tools into the truck slowly, delaying the departure without quite refusing to leave. Vernon looked back once at the yard. Several women were still at the fence line, hands wrapped around the wire, watching. He raised one hand in a half-wave that felt desperately inadequate. None of the women waved back. They just stood there, holding the fence, and Vernon thought that image would probably stay with him for the rest of his life. He was right. On the drive back, Ray said, "We should have brought more. Should have done it more often." Vernon shook his head. "We did what we could." But both of them felt the weight of it. The way small kindnesses can feel more painful when they end than if they'd never happened at all. They'd opened a door to normalcy, to dignity, and now it was being shut again. The women would return to the regulated meals, the careful portions, the food that sustained bodies but fed nothing else. Inside the camp, the women dispersed slowly from the fence line. There was no formation called, no order given. They simply drifted away in small groups, returning to their quarters in silence. Someone would cry later, in private. Someone else would rage quietly into her pillow. But in the moment, they just walked, carrying the weight of one more thing being taken away. The list of taken things was so long by now that this was barely remarkable. Barely, but not quite. Dorothy Mills stayed at her post long after the cowboy's truck had disappeared down the road. Captain Hewitt had returned to his office, satisfied that order had been restored. She stood alone in the yard, thinking about the past 7 weeks, about the small conspiracy she'd been part of. She wondered if she'd done the right thing by allowing it. She wondered if she'd done enough. The answer to both questions felt like yes and no simultaneously, and she'd have to live with that ambiguity. That night, Fumiko unwrapped the piece of brown paper she'd kept under her pillow. The grease stains had faded to almost nothing. It barely smelled like anything anymore, just paper and dust and time. She held it for a long while, then carefully folded it again and put it back. It was evidence. Proof that something had happened. That for 7 Saturdays, someone had seen them as people worth feeding, worth risking a reprimand for. That mattered. It would keep mattering. Keiko lay in her bunk and cataloged the meals from memory. Brisket first, then chicken, then tamales, then stew, then ham, then something with pork that had been incredible, then chicken again. 7 meals. She calculated the cost of the ingredients, the labor of preparation, the risk of sharing. The math came out to something she couldn't quite quantify, some value that exceeded simple addition. It came out to decency, to defiance, to the refusal to let the machinery of war completely dehumanize everyone it touched. The war ended 5 months later. News reached Crystal City in fragments, first the victory in Europe, then the atomic bombs, then Japan's surrender. The women received the information with complicated emotions. Relief that the killing had stopped. Horror at how it had stopped. Fear about what would happen to them now. They'd been prisoners during wartime. What were they now? The officials didn't seem to know either. The processing paperwork took months. Vernon enlisted immediately after VJ Day, despite his limp, despite the fact that the fighting was over. He wanted to be part of something, to contribute in a way he hadn't been able to during the actual war. The army sent him to occupy Japan as part of the reconstruction effort. He arrived in Yokohama in December 1945, 6 months after the Cowboys had been banned from the camp, and what he saw there shook him badly. The cities were broken. The people were starving. Children followed American soldiers begging for food with an intensity that reminded Vernon of something he couldn't quite place at first. Then he remembered. The women at the fence line. The way they'd leaned forward those first few Saturdays, bodies betraying what faces tried to hide. He started giving away more of his rations and was probably smart. Other soldiers did the same. The official policy was occupation, but the human reality was feeding people who needed to be fed. Ray stayed in Texas, took over his father's ranch when the old man's health failed. He married in 1947, had 3 children by 1952, built a quiet life that looked unremarkable from the outside, but he never forgot the women at the fence. He told his wife about them once, late at night, after they'd been married 15 years. She listened without interrupting, then said, "That was a good thing you did." He said, "It wasn't enough." She said, "It never is. You do it anyway." The women were released in stages throughout 1946 and 1947. Some were repatriated to Japan, sent back to a country many had never lived in, their lives in Peru erased by bureaucratic convenience. Others were allowed to return to South America, though most found their homes and businesses had been seized, their possessions sold, their places in society eliminated. A few were permitted to stay in the United States, sponsored by churches or family members who'd avoided detention. None of it was fair. None of it was justice. It was just the messy aftermath of panic-driven policy. Fumiko ended up in Los Angeles with her daughter. She found work as a seamstress, never taught again, never quite recovered the person she'd been before. But she kept the brown paper sack. When her daughter was old enough to ask about it, Fumiko told her the story of the Cowboys and the fence line, and the 7 Saturdays when someone had remembered they were human. Her daughter didn't entirely understand, not then. How could she? She'd been too young to remember the camp clearly. But she kept the paper after her mother died, preserved it in plastic, saved the story. Keiko returned to Peru, found her restaurant had been sold, her savings confiscated, her husband broken by the detention years. They started over, slowly, painfully. She cooked again, eventually opened a small cafe that never quite prospered but survived. She never made barbecue. The association was too complicated, too tied to a moment of kindness in the middle of cruelty. But she thought about it often, about the smell of mesquite smoke and the taste of meat that someone had wanted her to have. Sachiko settled in São Paulo, Brazil, married a Japanese-Brazilian man who'd avoided detention by virtue of being born in the right country. She had 4 children and lived to see grandchildren, which felt like its own kind of victory given that she'd lost a baby on the ship to Texas. She told her children the story of the Cowboys, simplified it for young ears. During the bad time, some kind men shared their food with us. It was enough. They understood kindness. That was the point. Dorothy Mills retired from the camp service in 1948, took a job at a regular women's prison in Houston, where the moral ambiguities were somehow easier to manage. She never spoke about Crystal City, never mentioned the Saturdays when she'd looked the other way. But she thought about it, especially later in life when her own health began failing and she had time to review her choices. She never quite decided if she'd done enough, but she knew she'd done something. That had to count for something. The Crystal City internment camp was closed in 1948. The buildings were repurposed, then eventually demolished. The land returned to regular use, the history mostly forgotten except by those who'd been imprisoned there and their descendants. No plaques marked what had happened. No memorials listed the names of the families who'd been held. It became one of those historical footnotes that textbooks mention briefly, if at all, in the long, complicated story of World War II and American civil liberties. Vernon came home from Japan in 1949, used the GI Bill to study agriculture, ended up teaching at a community college in El Paso. He never married, though people asked. He seemed content alone, or at least accustomed to it. He kept the memory of the women private, rarely spoke about it, but it shaped things in subtle ways, the way he treated his students, the way he talked about the Japanese-American community in El Paso, the way he voted on certain issues, immigration and civil rights, and the small local policies that determined who was seen as fully human. In 1973, Vernon received a letter that had been forwarded through 3 addresses before finding him. The return address was Los Angeles. Inside was a short note in careful English. "You probably don't remember me, but in 1945, you and another man shared your lunch with prisoners at Crystal City Camp. I was one of those women. I'm writing because my daughter is getting married, and I want to thank you for reminding me that kindness existed. That memory helped me survive many hard times after. I hope your life has been good. With gratitude, Fumiko Hayashi." Vernon sat at his kitchen table holding that letter for a long time. He tried to remember specific faces from that spring 28 years earlier, but they'd blurred together in memory. He couldn't pull Fumiko's face out of the group. But he remembered the moment clearly. The fence, the smell of brisket, the sound of paper rustling as small portions were divided and shared, he wrote back. The correspondence continued sporadically for years, never frequent, but never quite stopping. Just 2 people acknowledging that something had happened, that it had mattered. Ray received a similar letter in 1975, forwarded from his mother's old address. This one was from Keiko, writing from Lima, where she'd finally been able to return permanently. Her English was better than Fumiko's, more confident. She described the small cafe she ran, the grandchildren who helped her cook, the life she'd rebuilt from ruins. "I want you to know," she wrote, "that what you did gave me strength later when I wanted to give up. You showed me that hatred wasn't universal. That meant something. It still means something." Ray showed the letter to his wife. She cried reading it, then laughed at herself for crying. "You old fool," she said. "Affectionate. You've been carrying this around for 30 years and never said how much it mattered." Ray shrugged. "Didn't know if it had mattered. We just fed some people a few times." His wife shook her head. "That's not what this letter says. This letter says you gave someone hope. That's not nothing." Ray kept the letter in his desk drawer, read it sometimes when he was feeling low. Dorothy Mills never received a letter. The women hadn't known her name, didn't know how to thank someone for simply looking away at the right moments. But in the early 1980s, she read an article in the Houston Chronicle about the Crystal City Camp, a retrospective piece marking some anniversary. The article mentioned the difficult conditions, the family separated, the slow process of release and return. It mentioned nothing about cowboys, or fence lines, or Saturday lunches. Dorothy clipped the article anyway. She filed it with other papers she'd kept from those years, duty rosters, incident reports, the mundane paperwork of imprisonment. She'd never spoken about her time at Crystal City, not even to her sister who'd asked occasionally. But she kept the records. Evidence that she'd been there, that she'd witnessed things, that she'd made small choices in small moments. Whether those choices had been enough, she still didn't know. But they'd been hers. That had to mean something. Sachiko wrote no letters. She'd moved on more completely than the others, or tried to. She rarely spoke about the camp years, deflected when her children asked questions. But one night in 1982, her oldest daughter brought home a documentary about Japanese internment in the United States. Sachiko watched silently as the program covered Executive Order 9066, the camps in California and Arizona, the families torn apart, the property confiscated. Then, unexpectedly, there was a brief segment on the lesser-known camps, the detention facilities for Japanese from Latin America. Crystal City was mentioned by name. Sachiko stood up abruptly and left the room. Her daughter found her 20 minutes later sitting in the dark kitchen. "I was there," Sachiko said quietly. "In that place they mentioned." Her daughter sat down waiting. And then, for the first time in 37 years, Sachiko told someone outside the family about the camp. About the hunger, the fear, the long months of not knowing what would happen. And about 2 cowboys who'd shared their lunch one Saturday, then kept sharing it week after week until someone made them stop. "Why are you telling me this now?" her daughter asked. Sachiko considered the question. "Because I'm getting old. Because these things should be remembered. Because I want you to know that even in the worst places, Sometimes people are kind. Her daughter asked if she'd ever tried to find the Cowboys to thank them. Sachiko shook her head. I didn't know their names. I'm not even sure they knew ours, but that was okay. The kindness didn't need names to be real. That conversation led to others. Sachiko's children began asking more questions, recording her stories, preserving the memories. One of her sons was a history teacher in São Paulo. He incorporated his mother's experiences into his lessons about World War II, about the costs of fear and racial prejudice, about the small acts of resistance against dehumanization. His students were skeptical at first that something as small as sharing lunch could matter much. Then they thought about it longer and began to understand. In 1989, the United States Congress passed the Civil Liberties Act, offering formal apologies and reparations to Japanese Americans who'd been interned during World War II. But the legislation primarily covered U.S. citizens and legal residents. The Japanese Latin Americans, the category that included most of the Crystal City women, fell into a bureaucratic gap. They'd been kidnapped from other countries, imprisoned in the United States, then deported or released without compensation. The government that had detained them now claimed they weren't properly within the scope of redress. Fumiko heard about this exclusion from her daughter, who'd become active in the Japanese American community in Los Angeles. The injustice of it lit something in Fumiko that had been dormant for years. She was 75 years old, had spent decades keeping her head down and just surviving. But this she couldn't let pass. She joined the coalition of Japanese Latin Americans pushing for inclusion in the reparations program, testified at community hearings, told her story publicly for the first time in 44 years. At one of these hearings in San Francisco, a reporter asked Fumiko if she had any good memories from the camp, anything positive in all that darkness. Fumiko thought about the question carefully. Then she told the story of the Cowboys. She described the brisket, the fence line, the 7 Saturdays, the small rebellion of 2 young men who decided that rules about feeding prisoners were rules worth breaking. The reporter included the story in his article. It got picked up by a larger paper. Someone in El Paso read it. Vernon was 81 years old when a former student called to tell him there was an article about him in the San Francisco Examiner. Not exactly about him, but the story matched what the student remembered Vernon mentioning once years ago. Vernon got a copy of the article, read it 3 times. Fumiko hadn't used his name because she didn't know it. But she'd described him, young, limping slightly, kind eyes, a man who'd turned his back so that breaking rules would be easier. He knew immediately it was about those Saturdays. Vernon called the reporter, left a message identifying himself. The reporter called back within an hour, excited. They talked for 90 minutes. The reporter wanted to set up a reunion, a photo opportunity, a feel-good story about people reconnecting across decades. Vernon said no. He didn't want to turn it into a spectacle. But he did want to speak with Fumiko, if she was willing. The reporter passed along contact information. Vernon waited 2 days, trying to figure out what to say, then called her. The conversation was awkward at first. 2 elderly people trying to bridge a gap of 44 years and vastly different experiences. Fumiko thanked him. Vernon said he wished he'd done more. Fumiko said what he'd done had mattered, had given her something to hold onto in dark times. Vernon said he'd just shared his lunch. It wasn't anything special. Fumiko said yes, it was. He didn't understand, maybe couldn't understand, what it meant to be treated like a human being when the entire system was insisting you weren't one. They talked for an hour. Vernon mentioned Ray, wondered if Fumiko would want to speak with him too. Fumiko said yes. Vernon tracked down Ray, who was still on the ranch, 86 years old, and still working despite his children's protests. Ray took the information, said he'd think about calling. Then he called the next day. His conversation with Fumiko was shorter, less comfortable with emotional territory, but real. When he hung up, he sat on his porch for a long time, just thinking. The 3 of them never met in person. The distances were too great, their ages too advanced, the complications of travel too much. But they exchanged letters occasionally, calls on birthdays and holidays. Fumiko told her daughter it felt like closing a circle, bringing completion to something that had been left open for decades. Vernon told his favorite student that it was good to know small things. If you've stayed with this story all the way to here, you understand something important. That history isn't just the big moments and famous names. It's the small choices made by ordinary people in impossible situations. It's the cowboys who share their lunch. It's the prisoners who divide portions fairly. It's the guard who looks the other way. It's the memory kept alive by a piece of brown paper saved for 44 years. Please like this video. Leave a comment telling me what small act of kindness you've witnessed or received that stayed with you. Subscribe to this channel so these stories, these fragile memories of decency, don't disappear. Because if we forget that humans can be kind even in the worst circumstances, we lose something essential about ourselves. Ray died in 1991, working on his ranch until 3 days before the end. His funeral was well attended, family and neighbors and ranch hands who'd learned from him over the decades. The eulogy mentioned his service during the war years, his dedication to his family, his skill with cattle. It didn't mention the Saturdays at Crystal City. His wife considered bringing it up, decided it would require too much explanation. But she placed Keiko's letter in his casket, tucked into his jacket pocket. He should have that with him, she thought. It was important. Vernon lived until 1997, died quietly in his sleep at age 83. He left his small estate to a scholarship fund for first-generation college students, with a preference for immigrants and refugees. The fund administrator found, among his papers, a folder containing letters from Fumiko, newspaper clippings about Japanese Latin American detention, and a note in Vernon's handwriting that said simply, "For the women at the fence. I'm sorry we couldn't do more." The administrator didn't understand the context but kept the folder with the fund's archives. Fumiko outlived them both, made it to 2003, died at 89 surrounded by children and grandchildren who'd heard the story of the cowboys so many times they could recite it. Her daughter found the brown paper sack after, still preserved in plastic, still tucked away in her mother's things. The family debated what to do with it. Throw it away, keep it, donate it to a museum? Eventually they settled on keeping it, adding it to the family archive along with photos and documents and the other small artifacts that told the story of who they were and where they'd come from. Keiko passed in 2005, having returned to her cafe in Lima one last time before her health failed completely. She left recipes for her grandchildren, detailed instructions on running the business, and a request that someone keep making the dishes she'd perfected over decades. At her funeral, her oldest grandchild mentioned that she'd always refused to make barbecue, even though customers asked for it. The family had never understood why. Now hearing the stories shared at the service, they began to piece together the complicated associations, the memories of kindness tangled with memories of imprisonment. Sachiko lived longest, made it to 2011, died at 96. Her children organized a memorial service in São Paulo that drew more than 200 people, including former students from the school where her son taught. Several of those students had become teachers themselves, had incorporated the story of the Crystal City camp and the cowboys into their own lessons. The story had spread beyond one family, become part of how a community understood history and human decency in dark times. The Crystal City campsite is now a historical marker, placed in 2016 after years of advocacy by former detainees and their descendants. The marker mentions the families held there, the conditions they endured, the slow process of release. It doesn't mention the cowboys. There's no way it could. The documentary record is too sparse. The official reports don't include Saturday lunches that violated protocol. History preserves what's written down formally, and small acts of kindness often aren't. But the story survives anyway, passed down through families, shared in community gatherings, included in oral history projects by universities studying the internment experience. Fumiko's daughter donated her mother's papers to the Japanese American National Museum in Los Angeles, including the brown paper sack and the letters from Vernon. Sachiko's son published a small book about his mother's life that included the chapter about the fence line. Keiko's coffee was eventually sold, but the new owners kept her name on it, kept some of her recipes, kept the memory alive. In 2018, a graduate student researching Japanese Latin American detention found Vernon's folder in the Scholarship Fund archives. She tracked down the connection to the newspaper article from 1989, found Fumiko's testimony, located Sachiko's son's book, pieced together the full story. She wrote her dissertation about small acts of resistance to dehumanization within the internment system. The Cowboys' lunches became a case study, an example of how individual choices can create cracks in even the most rigid systems of oppression. The dissertation led to a journal article, then a mention in a book about the home front during World War II, then a small footnote in a textbook. Not much, not fame, just a tiny acknowledgement in the vast historical record that something happened, that 2 cowboys and a guard and several women made choices that mattered, that kindness occurred, that dignity was preserved even when systems tried to eliminate it, that humans remained human in places designed to deny humanity. Today, there are descendants of those Crystal City women living across 3 continents. They carry DNA, family names, and stories. Most of them know about the camp. Many of them know about the cowboys. The details vary in the telling. Some versions have the cowboys sneaking food through the fence secretly. Other versions have them openly defying orders. The truth, as usual, is more complicated and more interesting than either simplified version. But what remains consistent across all tellings is the core. Someone saw their grandmothers, their great-grandmothers, and refused to look away. What do we do with stories like this? We remember them. We tell them. We let them complicate our understanding of history, which is never as simple as villains and heroes, never as clean as good people and bad people. We acknowledge that the same country that imprisoned families out of prejudice and fear also contained individuals who subverted that imprisonment in small ways. Both things are true. Both things matter. The system was wrong. The cowboys were right. Dorothy Mills was complicit and also courageous. Fumiko was a victim and also survived with dignity. All of it can be true simultaneously.